for the Man U party with Tenio, which I'm here with Simon, who oversees all of our coverage. And we came and we thought, there'll be a couple of people, it's packed.
And it is, I guess it's representative of how popular Manchester United is, or not, if not how popular, how intriguing they are to all sports fans.
It's a good party, actually. I mean, there's a lot of people, they have a stand, and people were joking that it was like their for sale stand, but they've definitely denied it.
They've denied that, although I think they are on the books for sale. You can have a Red Devil cocktail if you want before we leave.
We're still working, so maybe no alcohol.
It's one of the most bizarre things that you see on Promenade in Davos. This is the main road where you have all the millionaires, billionaires, the elite, the businessmen trying to talk. And I have seen over the years strange things, but there's a big Man United shop. And they had a nightcap. Some of the owners were there. The goalkeeper was there. But they say, look, this is not because they're up for sale.
Well, what are they doing? Selling merch to all of the hedge funders? I mean, what's the point of them setting up a big shop if they're not actually... Surely they're trying to catch the eyes of the Qatari investment fund, aren't they? Isn't that...
So we spoke to the Qatari investment fund, and he said, look, they're definitely looking at football investments.
Right. Football, the clubs and the sport is becoming very commercialized and very investment friendly. So you see even funds are becoming investors in this. And you will not be surprised if we invest this.
If you speak to the people having this basically Man U stand, it's not really a stand, it's really like a proper shop. I mean, it's glitzy, it's quite glamorous. They say it's just to talk about values. We've been in partnership for 10 years with the WEF, and this was the right time for us to do it.
Right, yeah.
Right.
And I believe that one. Well, can you pick me up a Rashford shirt, Francine? And,
yeah, sure. Maybe I'll get it signed.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. I'm David Merritt.
And I'm Francine Lacqua.
And this is In the City, Bloomberg's podcast connecting you to the stories and the voices at the heart of the city of London.
And Dave, this week, it's in the city, but actually in the Alps.
That's right. We're on tour. You, Francine, are in Davos for the World Economic Forum.
Yes, and I've always been fascinated by the rather large presence of UK businesses, UK politicians, that this year just does not seem to come through. So the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is not here. We'll discuss that with Phil Aldrick. Maybe it would have been a PR disaster if the billionaire Prime Minister shows up to Davos. But there is also a lack of business people on the ground.
I thought it was interesting that only one of the G7 leaders, Olaf Scholz of Germany, is coming. In fact, we had an interview with him, with our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, but pointedly not actually at Davos. He actually came into our bureau in Berlin. So none of the world's top leaders actually want to really be seen at this year's event. Why do you think that is?
And I hear that a lot. There's a lot of, even Wall Street titans that will come on TV with us, that will be here to do business, that will sign contracts, but don't really want to be seen because there's a huge backlash that this is, just a gathering of the rich and it doesn't actually achieve anything. Who is here is Keir Starmer, and he's here to drum us business, and I don't think he'll get any bad press at all.
Right. This isn't new, though, is it? But criticism of Davos for being just the elite talking to themselves, debating climate change, zooming in on a private jet. But why? And this is the first time they've all come back together, of course, in person in the winter, since before the pandemic. But why now do people feel like they can't sort of stomach the PR around that? I think that's pretty interesting. And yet, for some people who are kind of on the up, like Keir Starmer, it's still a place to come and be seen and to network.
So I am delighted to be joined by Phil Aldrick because you know what, Dave? He's been here 3 days. I've been here 3 days. We haven't actually seen each other because he's chasing the corridors. He's
I bet you were running around,
all
Phil.
The business. He has been running around. Phil Aldrick, who covers all things UK. Welcome.
Hi guys. I'm exhausted chasing around. I've got blisters, endless walking up and down. Not quite, not yet.
It is snowy and it is very cold, so it's more difficult than previous years just to find the right people to speak to.
Yeah, it's slippery. I think possibly that people were keeping a bit of a low profile because the cost of living crisis. It doesn't look good to be on the slopes celebrating your wealth and talking about very important things, but having jetted in when the rest of the world is struggling with massive inflation, etc. So we've had a lot of business people just trying to just keep a little bit more of a low profile than normal. I was speaking to one businessman recently who said he's been coming for God knows how long, like decades. And he said it used to be just business leaders. Now all these politicians are getting in the way. They're shining too much light on us. And he was saying they liked it when it was sort of more quiet event for the business community.
So Phil, really, it would have been impossible for Rishi Sunak to show up.
Yeah, it's very difficult for a billionaire to be coming in to speak to the other billionaires and also be a man of the people, as the Prime Minister would like to present himself as. But it's different for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. They are going to be, glad handing the business people on Thursday. They are going to be trying to build up their profile. One thing that was mentioned to me by one of the business leaders here, so Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves were actually invited by Klaus Schwab, and he has a sort of antenna for the coming people, and there's quite a sort of vote of confidence in Labour being future government in waiting.
That's interesting. I mean, but in the past, I just remember the big hitters politically used to come. Do you remember the circus when Donald Trump flew in? Xi Jinping coming. I remember, and of course, Theresa May slightly on the other side of the coin, not quite filling up the hall when she came to speak. But none of the G7 leaders are doing that big performance there. So yes, Schwab can invite, the up and comers, but the big names aren't there. Does the event this year feel a little bit lacking in one of those big moments?
They've got, so Ukraine obviously is such a massive agenda item, and you've got Zelensky here, so that does feel like
I suppose he's the biggest sort of star on the world stage.
He's by video.
He's
being beamed in by video.
And his wife was here. She gave personal address, didn't she? But doesn't quite have the star power that it's had in the past. And speaking to that point of everybody's being a little bit more muted.
I think it would have been very difficult for a global head of state to come here and give a big speech, given where we're in flux on foreign policy. So we had the vice premier of China, and it was the first time we heard from him in 3 years. I mean, it's the first time that he's met with Western officials. Interesting, he was talking about China reopening and, before it was closed, but he didn't actually mention the word COVID. So it is still a glimpse into foreign affairs that are extremely volatile. You don't know what happens in the next 12 months. So I don't know if it's the WEF not being able to attract that big name or no big name really having a strong message. If you come to the WEF and give a keynote, Phil, you better have a message behind it, right? When she came, it was we're reopening. That was, I think, in 2017. And now I guess it's just much more, there are just many more tensions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, von der Leyen is another one who's a big figure who has given a keynote address, and as you say, she did want people to know that Europe is going to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act that the US has set, which is one of the hot topics behind the scenes here. That this massive green subsidy scheme in America is causing big tensions between Europe and the US, and they're trying to resolve some of those tensions. And von der Leyen's speech was partly about that.
I mean, we're still in really frankly at war in Europe. How much is that prevalent in the Davos talk?
The sentiment in Ukraine is definitely changing in terms of there's fears that the two sides are really bedding in, and it's going to turn into something like Afghanistan or Syria, and it's going to be this sort of horrible years long. The front line doesn't move, and money is thrown at it, and Ukraine is constantly in losing economic, losing people, and it will need sort of just general support just to keep the economy going. In that respect, it's bleaker than it was back in May when people were thinking that there would be some quick solution. I think there's definitely a feeling that it's got worse.
What's Boris Johnson doing here? He can't stay off the circuit.
Boris Johnson, who has called Davos a constellation of egos. He's had this wonderful,
to which he's adding.
Exactly. He's massive criticism, saying he didn't ever want to come to Davos, a constellation of egos. He's on a panel. I think you know who he's with.
I think it's Viktor Punchuk, but it's not. So it's not part of the official program. These are like some of the side events. And this is something that I noticed more and more, Dave. I feel like the side events are actually almost bigger in terms of attendance.
Underground Davos. Underground Davos is what they call it.
Fringe.
Yeah, underground Davos, but with a lot of banners everywhere, so you know exactly where you're going.
In terms of the business people coming then, obviously the UK has always sent a lot of CEOs, people from the city. What is the vibe from the kind of the British delegation, if you like, coming to Davos? The UK economy has not been faring well, of course, comparatively to the rest of the world. We're out the other side of Brexit. What's the vibe from the Brits that you're running into?
Just before this whole thing, the Davos started, there was a poll of global CEOs. It was taken in October and November, so this might explain it, but they were miserable. Everyone's completely convinced that the economy is tanking. And then the vibe on the street among the business leaders is actually reasonable optimism. I mean, China reopening after COVID, that is expected to be a big boost. Actually, I think it was Alan Jope at Unilever. He said that we're going to see revenge spending. All these people who've been locked up for ages, the Chinese are going to go on revenge spending and just absolutely blow a fortune, which is going to help demand in the economy. And they're just generally seeing sort of people generally feel like there is momentum, and that's true for the Brits as well. I mean, people here are not singing the UK's praises. I mean, it was only a few months ago that we were the bête noire of the world, and cautionary tale after the Trussonomics debacle. But there's generally reasonably positive sentiment at the moment.
Yeah, and there are just not enough UK chief executives, I think, to get the temperature right. I don't know, Phil, who you've been chasing, but we had a lot of the head of UK banks or the regional heads of banks, and they say, look, it's going to be a tough year, IPOs are down, we still have to look at bonuses. We spoke to the head of EMEA for JP Morgan. He was saying, look, a lot of traders are expecting, or investment bankers are expecting, a bonus cut just because it hasn't been that buoyant.
The performance hasn't been there, so I mean, it's not even and people understand. I mean, this is kind of, if the performance isn't there, you don't expect it.
There's no big name. BP's here. He doesn't want to speak. He doesn't want to speak on stage. And so then if you look at, the FTSE 100, there's not that name that everybody really wants to speak to from the UK side.
Yeah, the UK hasn't really been a dominant presence here. That is definitely notable. Previous years, we have had rather large delegations, but this year we've really slimmed it back. We've got Grant Shapps, the business secretary, coming, and Kemi Badenoch, the trade secretary. So I think Grant Shapps is doing some public stuff, but Kemi Badenoch is not doing any media, so she's talking behind the scenes. It's a relatively muted affair. I guess we're in that economic stability stage of our recovery, rather than the sort of let's go out there and promote. A few years ago, we had banners all over the promenade. Britain is great in business, and we were going to be this big trade miracle. So yeah, we're kind of a mildly invisible presence this year, actually.
And I guess there's a repair job still going on, right? From the turmoil you mentioned over the summer, we had the kind of huge market dislocation after the Trussonomics experiment, and Sunak is trying to kind of steady the ship. How are people reading his performance, who you speak to, who are at Davos?
He is of their ilk. I spoke to Bill Winters, who just said 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10 for
10 out of 10.
Rishi Sunak.
There we go.
I mean, the people are generally positive about Sunak. I mean, he is a technocrat, managerial prime minister. In his, that you would probably describe him as that as his natural inclination. And we have business leaders who want stability. They want managerial excellence. I mean, he fits the Davos mold perfectly. So there is quite a lot of support for him.
And I'll let you know, Dave, what I think is a tad worrying me, because we had, and Phil actually mentioned the survey of PwC saying, I think they spoke to 4,000 business leaders, and they haven't been so pessimistic. But people here are optimistic that we've reached peak inflation. They've, I hear a lot of talk about, look, we're going to avoid a recession in Europe. We're going to avoid a recession in the US. And so there is that optimism creeping up from a lot of the bankers. And it's easy to forget that the most vulnerable of the population, which is what we're seeing in the UK, even if we skirt, the worst case scenario, the vulnerable are going even like a 2% jump in inflation hurts them a lot. And so then we talk about redistribution of wealth or something to help also the poorest of society. And that's something that I think is missing from these Davos conversations.
Yeah, I think Geeta Gopinath has just been on a panel where she was saying that fiscal policy, one of the big, it's got to be non-inflationary. It can't be just like massive government spending, and it's got to help those the most vulnerable members of society.
And while we have inflation and we need to bring inflation down, we also have the issue that there is high prices, which then calls for fiscal policy to provide support to the most vulnerable in society. So you have an inflation problem you have to deal with, but you're still hit with shocks that require fiscal policies to step up. And that's what's making the current conjuncture particularly difficult.
The point is being made, but it's not something, obviously, that is the focus of attention in the back rooms and the champagne swilling parties, etc.
Yeah, the equality agenda has often been on the list, hasn't it, at Davos, but it just rings a little hollow, doesn't it?
Dave wants to know about the parties.
Yeah, I do. Actually, I want to pivot onto the party. Where have you been, Phil? Who have you met? And what are the parties like?
I've only been here one night for parties. There was
Francine. I bet you've been to a few.
I've been to a few parties.
There we go.
But Phil first.
Well, there was a pretty good dinner on the first night where it was actually full of Ukrainian politicians who were incredibly compelling as you'd expect, and then masses of business figures who were one or two who were quietly going, well, I think there's going to have to be some kind of escape route for Putin, and we've got to get a ceasefire as quick as possible. So a bit of conflict in the room, and otherwise, it's just kind of been swilling a little bit of champagne and.
It's a modest amount, yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
I haven't actually. I've only drunk water, but I've had very late nights. I also start at 5 a.m. on a rooftop.
You have an early day.
Can we tell the bosses that we need, thicker layering?
Have you got enough puffer jackets?
Minus 12 degrees.
Yeah.
I have a very thick one. There's not the parties that there were 5-6 years ago, even 7-8 years ago, where you had celebrities, and it was. I remember like the Google parties where they used to fly in famous DJs. Frankly, thank God we don't have those anymore, because they'd be so out of touch with reality and what we're living through. I've been to a couple of private dinners that are usually held by big investors, and I find them just because the conversation is very open, and I've find it very interesting to talk to Middle East investors about what they think about the UK and whether now is the right time. And there's always talk about geopolitics. The QIA reception party is the place to be because they own so many assets and so many banks that all the bankers show up. so
right,
so
and
that was a good.
Spending,
it finished
right?
early, but it was good. And then and then there was a Man U nightcap yesterday, which was bizarre but very well attended.
I caught the end of the Skybridge Capital wine.
Oh, that's
drink.
Anthony Scaramucci.
Yeah. It was basically it was the dregs of the bottle that was left at the end, of which I was one because I turned up way too late.
Put yourself down. I think you were probably the star draw. But do you think the high rolling days are coming up? Is this just a pause in that kind of in the high rolling stages of Davos? Is it going to be back with more of a bang in years to come? Do you think?
We need a big industry, don't we? To like the banks were the kings of Davos, then the tech giants. So what is it of the future?
I mean, there was a crypto. I remember, what was it, in May? And it's very different. I'm really lobbying to have this in May because you don't have the snow boots and it's just so much easier to go around.
This
no
is
one's
last year's,
supporting
right?
me in
The
this.
summer edition. The spring
it was
edition.
May. Yes, May last year, where they moved it from January because of COVID. And you did have banners of Binance. You had a lot of the crypto firms. Those are completely gone. I actually think that, we're over it. No one wants to be seen partying and flying in, the big DJs anymore.
Yeah.
I think also because the Russian delegation was a massive contributor to the excess that was here.
So the sort of vodka parties and
exactly.
Thank you, Phil Aldrick.
You're welcome. Nice to speak.
Thanks for listening to this week's In the City. We will be back next week.
But in the meantime, if you like our show, please head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and rate, review and subscribe.
This episode was hosted by me, David Merritt.
And me, Francine Lacqua.
It was produced by Summer Sadi.
Editing and sound design by Blake Maples.
And special thanks to Phil Aldrick, Mariful Hussain and Abigail Morris.
And an extra special thanks to Tori Cochran, our biggest fan, an honorary producer here in Davos.